Alright, so I had a friend that was recently considering whether or not he should start playing Honkai Star Rail. He was someone that has never played the game before, and as a result started asking me and a couple of my other friends a bunch of questions about it, like how it plays, the pull economy, and a whole lot of other things. But the most prominent question that he kept going back to is whether or not it was actually worth playing the game in our eyes so late after it came out. And that kind of really stuck out to me. Like, genuinely, is HSR actually worth playing? Like, is the game good enough to the point where that if you were in my shoes, would you recommend it to him? So today, I kind of just wanted to explore that thought process a little bit and honestly just kind of have a discussion about whether or not someone should pick up Honkai Star Rail in 2026. But first, if you didn't know, Honkai Star Rail is currently entering its new 4.0 patch cycle with probably a whole bunch of new meta characters. I mean, surely Blade doesn't get screwed in the meta twice, right? So anyway, if you're looking forward to playing the patch and getting all the new characters, then you'll probably be interested in today's sponsor, Rushbuy.gg. Rushbuy.gg is a safe and reliable top-up site for all of your favorite gacha games, meaning you can top up in not just Honkai Star Rail, but other games like Genshin Impact and Wuthering Waves too. Rushbuy offers some great discounts throughout all the different games, all the way up to 36%, and with all the new characters coming soon in Honkai Star Rail, you'll probably want to save as much as you can, and Rushbuy's definitely got your back in terms of getting the best bang for your buck. Like, the prices of gacha games can be pretty expensive. I mean, have you seen the in-game prices here? On the other hand, Rushbuy has a lot of special bundles lined up for the 4.0 release that offer a crazy discount in comparison. And the best part is that they're extremely easy to use. All you've got to do is input your UID and select your server, and then your purchase will reach your account in seconds through official game-approved channels. Rushbuy ensures that your data and personal info remains encrypted and secure, all while giving you these discounts so you can be sure that your account will be perfectly okay while you're on your way to getting all the new characters. I mean, at least personally, I know I'm saving up for the new version of Blade, because I mean, have you seen the guy? If you do happen to have any issues, there's an insanely dedicated customer support team ready to solve any of your problems. So what are you waiting for? Click my link down in the description below and use my code on screen for another 15% off, and also don't forget to take a look at their special bundles for 4.0. Thanks again to Rushbuy.gg for sponsoring today's video, and let's get back to it. To lay out some groundwork about how I'm going to talk about this, I basically want to break the game down to the different sections that a new player would be going through. After all, this is a live service game that has had over 20 different patch updates, and there is a metric ton of content to go through. Some people will only want to do the story content, others will want to rush to Endgame, you've also got people that just kind of want to chill out and play a cheesy event every now and then, and others that want to just get as much rolling currency as possible so that they can go for their next anime waifu or whatever. So to start, I think it's worth talking about the new player experience with both the amount of content the game has and also the rolling currency you get from it. As I just mentioned, this game has gone through a ton of different patch updates, and unlike its predecessor Genshin Impact, it gives you the ability to play through some of the older content like events and whatnot so that you get to experience it and also get rewarded for it just like any other player did. Overall, there is genuinely a ton of different things that you can do as a new player. For one, if you're someone that wants to play through the story, well, boy are you in luck, because there's, wait for it, close to 90 hours of story to play throughout the game, and that's not even including the new stuff coming in 4.0. Now, I will say, to be clear, in my opinion, not all of that story is actually good content. I mean, when you have 90 hours of it, it's kind of hard for all of it to actually be good.
Before everything began, the world was in chaos.
Like, there has definitely been more than a couple patches that kind of ended up feeling like they just had too much fluff, or like they were fairly disconnected from the rest of the story, and I think that as a result, it is definitely worth going into it with that in mind. I will say though, each of the different patch cycles have been pretty different in terms of the story being told, and as a result, you might really like some of it, but also you might not like other parts of it. This is kind of anecdotal, but literally everyone that I've talked to always has differing opinions about which of the stories are the best in the different patch cycles. On one hand, someone might like the fun, space comedy type stories from 1.0 with Belobog and the Luofu, but on the other hand, I've seen people heavily dislike those stories and care a lot more for the grand and serious style of story that was told in 3.0 with Amphorius. Further beyond that, even within singular patch cycles, some people really only like certain parts of them. For example, for myself, the 3.4 patch of Amphorius was genuinely one of the best stories that I've read in all of the different gacha games I've played, and I've played more than a few to say the least, so that is pretty high praise if I do say so myself. Alongside that, at least personally in general with HSR, I would say that I'm a more meta-focused player, but there actually ended up being a few characters throughout the game's lifespan that I rolled for just because I liked them as characters, or because of the role they had in the story. And honestly, I think that's pretty great. Like, I'm someone who comes from older gachas where the story was the vast majority of the reason as to why you would roll for any given character, so anytime a more modern age gacha can do the same thing, that is a massive plus in my eyes. Again though, that is just my personal experience, so definitely take it with a grain of salt. With that said, I do have to mention here that while the story has had its ups and downs, at the end of the day that's all pretty subjective. What isn't super subjective though is the way that their story is told. HSR is a 3D based game, and there are plenty of pretty sizable map environments that you go through as a result of that. But with that said, the maps as well as the way the dialogue is presented to you as the player doesn't always make use of those things all that well. Like, you would think that in a 3D game there would be some pretty frequent use of the environments to create, something like a spectacle shot where the space is used to develop the story or show some cool things to the player. But honestly, a lot of the time the story ends up just being told to you rather than shown to you.
You're not wrong to think of it that way. The golden threads of Nestia entwine us, capable of sensing even the slightest quiver. We are bound to speak the truth to each other this way. You will learn the truth about this one.
There are definitely some exceptions. Again, I do have to mention the 3.4 story here, but the game has absolutely been described as a visual novel more than a couple times, and I have to say that I would generally agree with that statement. If you are someone that's okay with visual novel type storytelling, then you probably won't have a problem with it at all, but at least in my experience, I've seen more than a few people turned away as a result of that. Despite that, it is actually still worth trying though, because at the end of the day, if you don't end up liking it, there's a nice little feature in the top right of almost every story cutscene now, and that's the skip button. So if you do give it a shot and decide you're not a huge fan, or if your only goal is to get in, get your rewards, and then get out, then honestly, it really won't end up taking you that long to make your way through it, and you'll be left with a fairly sizable pile of stellar jades for your trouble. Overall, I think that if you're someone that really enjoys story content, and if you're willing to look past the few patches here and there that have a lot of fluff or take too long to get going or whatever else, then I think there is more than enough content to play through and keep you interested in the game long term. With 4.0 coming soon, I really only expect that to continue, but we'll have to see. Aside from that, as I mentioned earlier, the game does actually let you play through older events and get the rewards from them, which is a pretty big boon to newer players in my eyes. I mean, honestly, there's a huge amount of things available for you to do, and all of those things are pretty varied in terms of what you do in it, and that makes the beginning part of the game pretty enjoyable, at least in my eyes. Like, one day you could be playing the Bird Clash event, which is basically a kind of Candy Crush knockoff. The next, you could be decorating your room in the Astral Express. Another day you could be puzzle solving. Yet another, you could be doing a combat event, or you could even be going through some of the story-focused events. The variety offered here leaves something for everyone, and you can also get a ton of rewards for playing through them. But that's not all. There's also a huge chunk of gameplay content that's now technically considered defunct because newer versions of it have been released, but for a new player, they're chock full of various different gameplay content as well as rewards for you to grab. For example, one of the earliest content offerings in HSR was called the Simulated Universe, which is sort of like a roguelike mode that an endgame player like myself usually only interacts with once every other week or so. This mode has had multiple different iterations, from the base game mode where you basically go through different themed planets, to the Swarm Disaster that's got unique gameplay based around dice and pathing through a map, to Golden Gears, which was essentially an expansion on the Swarm Disaster, and even the Unknowable Domain, which, while probably my least favorite one, at least tried to be unique by giving players the opportunity to play through the game in an entirely different way through a kind of item system. In each of those different iterations of the simulated universe, not only was there hours upon hours of actual gameplay content, there was also thousands upon thousands of J's just waiting for the player to collect, easily amounting to more than enough to get a 5-star character just by playing and going through those modes. If you're someone that could get hooked on roguelike gameplay and making your character stronger and stronger each time you played, then it results in a massive amount of content that is also pretty massively rewarding. And on that note, I think it's pretty worth discussing the fact that by playing through all this content, whether it's the simulated universe or events, and then getting the jades from it, you'll actually end up with more than enough currency overall that if you really wanted to, you would not only be able to get just one 5-star like I mentioned earlier, but you would also easily be able to set up a couple teams to play through the content with. For new players, this is honestly really important in my opinion, because the spice of life, so to say, will come from getting new characters to play with, and this is especially important as, like I mentioned earlier, we are entering an entirely new patch cycle with entirely new mechanics that characters will have for you to play around with. Overall, as a new player, I think it goes without saying that you would be fairly happy with the rewards you get, but I do have to say that it comes with a caveat that you have to actually play through the content to get it. That's kinda crazy, I know. Depending on the kind of player you are, you might be someone that plays more casually, and as such, it will be more difficult for you to get a bunch of different teams online, though again, that will entirely depend on the person. Now, speaking of the rewards that you can get and all the characters that you can get with them, I think it's a good time to talk about how those characters feel to play. I need to say this at the start of this section, and this is a pretty important point, so listen closely. This is a modern day gacha game, and what that means is that pretty much ever since gacha games have gone 3D and have been considered to be more similar to AAA titles, the monetization in these games have pretty much entirely revolved around just getting the characters and then giving players as much incentive as possible to get new ones. And what that means is that there's usually something that happens in these more modern games that will make your average gacha player quake in their boots. And it's actually just one word: power creep. If you're unfamiliar with power creep, the short way of explaining it is that as time goes on, to give you as the player an incentive to roll for new characters that goes beyond the simple stuff like, oh, this character's pretty cute, the developers of these modern titles will continually increase the strength of new characters as they're released. So, for example, if a character released in the first cycle of the game's lifespan and they deal 1000 damage, a character that's released in the second patch cycle might deal 10,000 damage. In the third, they might deal 100,000 damage, and unfortunately, the same can be said for supports and healers too. Like, they'll be giving more buffs or they'll heal more than their previously released counterparts do. In HSR, this is pretty much no different. Most of the characters released early on in the game's lifespan really aren't all that great anymore, and as a result, some of the characters you'll see playing through the story or going through different events won't actually be that useful for your account. Now that said, they do have a buffing system called Nova Flare where a few of the characters have gotten improved from their base kit, though how successful those buffs were highly varies depending on the character. This is a kinda shameless plug, but I did actually release a video about a month ago that discusses that topic in detail, so feel free to go give that a watch too. Overall though, what you should expect as a new player is that if you get the new lineup of characters that's currently being favored by the game and then you invest into them, you'll be feeling pretty good regardless of what kind of content you play, whether that's just the more basic stuff and casual content or the more difficult endgame content. That said, most characters nowadays kinda want a full team to go along with them, so that does make it pretty difficult if you're pushing into more endgame content that requires multiple teams. Like, it's not always plug and play in the sense that you could pick any character you want from one meta and then play them with a character from an entirely different one. They don't always coexist perfectly, and as a result, you are kind of incentivized to go for multiple different teams because all of them work together within their own ecosystem. If you're not someone that's interested in clearing or even participating in endgame content, then honestly, I really wouldn't worry that much about the endgame or whatever character is better than another one. At a bare minimum, even the older characters that have been power crept to all hell still can clear the story and events with ease, and they'll be able to clear some of the endgame content if you truly desire to do it with them. Though I will say how much they can clear will definitely vary from character to character. Hopefully, as we do go into a new patch cycle, the Nova Flares that I mentioned earlier will start happening more often, and then I won't have to give this long-winded disclaimer about the meta, but only time will tell and we'll just have to see. Lastly, to continue on from the previous point, there is actually a lot of stuff to do if you are someone that likes participating in endgame content or just more difficult kinds of content, especially so if you're someone that wants to chase the meta and the newest strong characters. The endgame in HSR is currently split into 4 different modes, technically 5 if you include the hard mode versions of the simulated universe, but that's not really counted. For one, there's the Memory of Chaos, where you generally fight elite enemies, which are one tier down from bosses, and sometimes you fight the bosses too. For the most part, these fights are just you and your character's builds versus the exact same fight that you might see in the story or in the overworld. There are some buffs given to you, but for the most part I wouldn't say that they're super impactful. In general, your goal is to defeat the enemies within a certain amount of cycles, or in other words, a certain amount of turns. Next, there's Pure Fiction, which is generally where you fight what I would consider trash enemies, or in other words, the basic grunts that you can find when roaming around. In this mode, you fight wave after wave of enemies, and the more you defeat, the more points you get. If you defeat all of the different waves, and again there are a lot of them, then you win. And the last main endgame mode is Apocalyptic Shadow, which in a sense is somewhat similar to the Memory of Chaos in that you can fight bosses, but the fights are pretty different from the ones that you might fight in the story. For example, there's a boss called Hule who in the normal mode just has really high speed and attacks you super often. But in Apocalyptic Shadow on the other hand, there is an added mechanic where he forces one of your characters to duel him 1v1 instead of fighting your entire team. As a result, this game mode offers a pretty decent amount of variety and ends up feeling pretty different from the other modes in my eyes. Alongside that, the criteria for clearing is action value instead of turns or points based on kills, and action value is basically a different kind of point system where the less actions both you and the enemy take, the more points you get, which feels at least a little bit different, at least to me. Apart from those 3 main modes, there was recently a new mode added called Anomaly Arbitration, and that game mode is what most people consider the hardcore endgame. Like, even if you're someone that can clear the other 3 with max stars and stuff like that, this one might still be one that you struggle with. Basically, there is a big boss, and that boss has 3 knights. If you don't defeat the knights first, then that boss will be extremely strong, but the more knights you defeat, the weaker that boss is. At least from the few iterations of it that we've seen so far, the different knights are unironically sometimes more challenging than the boss itself, though that's mostly due to the fact that each of the knights are generally catered to specific teams or different damage types. So as an example, one of them lowers your crit damage stat depending on how low the HP of the enemy you're fighting is, which heavily pushes the damage archetypes that don't rely on crit damage. And unfortunately, if you don't have those archetypes, well, that's too bad and you'll end up struggling to clear it. Honestly, out of all 4 of those modes, I would personally say that I like Pure Fiction the most, and I think that's mostly because it's more of an arcade type of fight where you're just fighting massive waves of enemies and stuff like that, rather than, you know, the more hardcore, this is Endgame kind of fight. For me at least, the amount of enemies that you have to fight results in a really fun experience, but just like I said earlier with the story, each and every person will have a different one that's their favorite. Lastly, I do have to mention one thing here that's pretty important. While each of the modes do play differently, all of the modes do have one thing in common, and that's a timer. Basically, even though the way to win is different, the end result is still beating the different stages before the game says, hey, you're out of time. In something like MOC, that's the cycles or the turns that I mentioned. In Pure Fiction, it also has cycles, so even though it is a points-based game mode, it's basically just get as many points before your cycles run out, and in Apocalyptic Shadow, like I said earlier, it's based on how many actions you take, and if you take too many, then you run out of time and you don't score high enough. Anomaly Arbitration is even worse in this aspect because the time you have to clear is lower than the other modes. So, while there is a lot of variety in terms of what you're actually doing, you know, in one you're mob clearing and another you're boss killing and stuff like that, at the end of the day they do feel kind of similar to each other, so it is definitely worth keeping that in mind prior to playing any kind of endgame. All in all, if I had to answer the question of whether or not it's worth it to play HSR, I honestly think without a doubt my answer would be yes. Despite the problems that the game does have, something that I've always said is while the game can get worse the longer you play it, that's really only true if you're someone that really cares about clearing all of the content across the game. Not just the story, not just the events, but endgame content too. It also might affect you if you're someone that gets hyper invested into very specific characters and your favorite one falls off, but generally, at least in my experience, there is usually more than a few characters that each player can get attached to. If you're someone that just plays games to enjoy them, or if you're someone that can get really invested in different stories and characters, then at least in my opinion, this is definitely a game worth playing in 2026. At the end of the day, it's worth keeping in mind that despite being a gacha, and despite the problems that it does have, this is just a game. It is super easy to get caught up in all the drama that always surrounds gacha games, or on a more micro level, it's easy to get caught up in all the different pitfalls that gacha games have, where you might feel FOMO or the need to chase after one character or another just to keep up with how the game is going. At least personally though, like I said earlier, I have generally been a meta-focused or endgame kind of player, but I realized that once I just kind of stop for a moment to chill out and just play the game as it is rather than focusing on all those other things that might have made me enjoy it less, it honestly ended up improving my experience with the game tenfold, and I actually really do like the game again now. Without a doubt, this is just a good game at its core, and as long as you don't get attached to constantly chasing the meta or whatever the new hot thing with the game is, I really do recommend at least trying the game if you haven't and making your own opinion on it. Like, don't let me or any other content creator out there tell you how you should feel, because at the end of the day, it's all just feelings, and everyone is going to be different. But anyway, to wrap up here, hopefully this was a useful video to those of you that may be on the fence about trying the game, and for those of you that might have played in the past, maybe it'll give you a different perspective of sorts if you are considering returning. As always, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.